A Spokane native who averaged nearly 20 points per game last year entered the transfer portal. Could he be coming home to join the Zags?
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today is our Nolan Hickman season in review episode, talking about every player on Gonzaga's roster. We're talking about their history, their season last year, their future, their legacy, all sorts of good stuff. We're going to get to the Nolan Hickman portion of the show in the second and the third segments. We are going to start talking about another transfer portal potential addition. This isn't a player that has been directly connected to Gonzaga yet. However, it is a player who is from Spokane, certainly worth making acknowledgement on that. That would be Dylan Darling from Idaho State. Dylan Darling is a 6'2" redshirt junior guard from Spokane, Washington. He played at Central Valley High School in the Spokane Valley area, so very local, very close to home for Dylan Darling. Coming off a tremendous season at Idaho State. Prior to arriving at Idaho State, however, Darling actually began his career at Washington State in Pullman. He was there as a freshman and as a sophomore. As a freshman in the 2022-23 season, he actually played 25 games and made 4 starts for the Cougars. So somebody who was trusted with a relatively big role right away as a true freshman for Kyle Smith's team. However, despite playing 25 games, despite making 4 starts, he only played about 12 minutes per game, and the numbers just were not there. Less than 2 points, less than 2 rebounds per game. He was not somebody who contributed very much as a freshman at Wazoo. And then his sophomore season, he only played 3 games before he ultimately ended up redshirting. So that season basically was wiped out completely. That was the 23-24 season, Kyle Smith's final year as the head coach at Washington State, the season where they made the NCAA tournament, and Smith parlayed that into a chance to go coach at Stanford in the ACC, weirdly enough. So Dylan Darling hits the transfer portal. That year does not count against him, so he was entering his redshirt sophomore year for Idaho State, which is where he ultimately landed in Pocatello, Idaho, out on the southeast side of the state of Idaho in the Big Sky Conference for the Bengals. And he exploded during his redshirt sophomore season with the Bengals. 28 games, started every single one of them, played about 35 minutes per night. So immediately thrust into a high-level, high-leverage role for this Idaho State club. And why wouldn't he be? His numbers were fantastic. 19.8 points per game, 5.7 assists, 3.4 steals, and 3.4 rebounds, and 1.7 steals per game. Shot about 50% from 2-pointers, shot about 35.5% from 3. That was on just over 5 attempts per game, and was 81% from the free throw line. Worth acknowledging that we saw him be a very effective three-point shooter, even in a limited role at Wazoo as well. So somebody who certainly can shoot the ball quite effectively. And again, I've been talking about it on the show quite a bit. Volume and efficiency are important. 35 is not elite by any stretch, but 35 on 5 attempts per game in an offense where you were the best offensive player on an otherwise fairly average team is certainly more relevant than 35% on a low volume where it's like, that's probably not going to translate all that well. Darling scored in double figures in every single game except for his very first game at Idaho State. That was against Arizona State. He had 8. Every other game he scored 10 or more points. One game against a team, an Arizona State team that didn't finish the season all that well, but was pretty good at the early part of the year where he had 8. A couple other performances. 22 points, 7 assists on 6 of 12 shooting at USC. That was back on November 7th. So very early in the year, dropping 22 on a pretty decent USC team. But really where Darling shined was the end of the season. He missed some time in the middle of the season or in the middle of the non-conference season, but came back, played well early in conference play, and then just turned on the absolute jets toward the end of the season. In the final 11 regular season games, for the Idaho State Bengals, Dylan Darling averaged 25.5 points per game, 6 assists, 4.6 rebounds, over 2 steals. He shot 55.7% on 2-pointers, attempting nearly 10 a game. So in the final 11 games of the season, he was taking 10 2-point shots per game, knocking them down well over 50% of the time. He also shot 39% from three. That was on 6.7 attempts per game. So all told, in the final 11 games of the season, Darling was taking 10 twos and 6.5 or about 7 threes per game, and he was knocking them both down at an incredibly efficient clip. Just insane levels of productivity to close out the season for Dylan Darling at Idaho State. He was named the Big Sky Player of the Year, entirely justified for the 6'2" left-hander who just went crazy down the stretch. After the season, he announced on social media that he was planning to return to Idaho State. Did one of those, I mentioned this earlier on the show. One of my least favorite things about the new era of college basketball is when players announce that they're returning to school. I just don't think that that's necessary. I get why it has become more necessary. I'm not going to be upset if Braden Huff makes that announcement, let's be honest, but I think that they're kind of silly. And in part because eventually the transfer portal window is going to close. And if you're not in the portal, then we know you're coming back to school. If you announce you're coming back to school before the transfer portal window close, you might make yourself look like a liar. And that's what happened with Dylan Darling. He made an announcement, the whole deal. Dear Bengals Nation, I loved playing for you this past year. I'm announcing that I'm returning to Idaho State for my junior year. Excited to get back at it, Pocatello, blah, blah, blah. And then a week later, he enters the transfer portal. It's not a great look. I'm not saying that that's disqualifying in terms of pursuing him. Heck, Gonzaga might have been part of the reason that he decided to enter the transfer portal. I'm just saying maybe don't make that announcement if there's any chance you're going to change your mind. What caused Dylan Darling to change his mind? Probably somebody saying, hey, if you enter the portal, we're going to make you an offer. Here's an amount of money. And his eyes got all wide and he said, oh, maybe I should enter the transfer portal, because if we're being honest, Idaho State probably not paying a bunch of big money out of the NIL pockets right now. So Dylan Darling getting an opportunity to cash in somewhere else. No specific teams have been connected to Dylan Darling at this time. I'm recording this about 3 p.m. on Tuesday afternoon. He's only been in the portal for about 24 hours. I'm sure in the very near future, maybe even by the time you're listening to this, we'll have a list of teams. I'm curious if we will see him be connected mostly to teams kind of close to home for him, whether that is Gonzaga, whether that's a return to Washington State. Usually players don't go back to the same school, but a new coaching staff, maybe. Certainly David Riley and the Cougs could use some reinforcements. They got a lot of players in the portal, a lot of guys graduating. Nate Calmise is gone. Izaiah Watts is gone. That's their two smaller guards, so they need some help there. Maybe UW gets interested in bringing him to the other side of the state. Maybe Boise State. That feels like a pretty logical potential destination for him as well if he wants to stay in the state of Idaho. And again, we're just kind of projecting potential local schools. It doesn't mean that there could be schools on the East Coast who are interested in Dylan Darling. It doesn't necessarily mean he's limited to this area. Just worth acknowledging the connection to Spokane and, of course, how that could relate to him being a target for Gonzaga. So he's a redshirt sophomore, meaning he has 2 years of eligibility remaining. Dylan Darling does. I think the biggest kind of caveat or concern or question we would have about his fit at Gonzaga is his size. He's 6'2", according to Basketball Reference. A lot of the social media posts referencing Dylan Darling, like, look at these video clips of him, call him 6'1". Either way, he's not big. He's not big. He plays point guard for the most part. Obviously, he had really good assist numbers last year, so we know that he's capable of being a facilitator, but he is a score-first guard who is not particularly big. I'm not sure again, we're about to spend 2 full segments talking about Nolan Hickman, and Dylan Darling is not the three-point shooter that Nolan Hickman is, but he is a somewhat similar player. I think he's probably a better facilitator, but one of the things I've been talking about a lot on this show, and I think we're going to see Gonzaga prioritize based on their previous known targets, is they want some more length, they want some more size on this team. They don't want to have a backcourt full of small guards, and they already have a small guard in Braden Smith, the Colgate transfer who redshirted last year, who's going to very likely be the starting point guard next year. He's listed at 6 foot or 6'1". So if Dylan Darling were to come in and compete to start at the 2, you'd have the same issue you had in the Ryan Nembhard, Nolan Hickman backcourt, where you'd have 2 guards under 6'3" who are both starting and playing big minutes. It was a significant problem for Gonzaga, and frankly, Nembhard and Hickman is probably a better offensive duo than Smith and Darling, at least from a scoring and facilitating perspective. It's not really a knock on either Smith or Darling. It's more of a compliment to Nembhard, the greatest facilitator in Gonzaga basketball history, and Hickman, who is a 45% three-point shooter, albeit somebody who was inconsistent on the offensive end. We're going to get a lot more into that later in the show. However, I do think that's a sticking point with Darling. I don't know if Gonzaga would be comfortable. I doubt they promise a lot of starting roles to players necessarily, but I really don't think they would promise somebody like Dylan Darling, we're going to start you alongside Braden Smith. I doubt they would promise Darling a starting spot over Braden Smith. That'd be an incredibly crappy way to treat a player who transferred to your program and redshirted for a year in order to get a starting spot. I'm not saying Smith needs to be guaranteed a starting spot, but if you guarantee a spot to somebody else, you're going to really piss him off. And I don't think that's a move that the staff is willing to make or reasonably would make, just from a being a good human being perspective, if we're being honest on that. So I do think that is an area where if you could get Darling to come off the bench as like a microwave sixth man scoring option where you get another two guard, or if Venters is healthy, he plays the two, Warley plays the three, you have Darling and Innocente off the bench. I love that guard rotation. I don't know if you convince Darling to transfer to Gonzaga where he's likely coming off the bench. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. I don't know what those conversations look like. That is where I could see a bit of a sticking point here, though. But I mentioned Venters, so I want to mention him again here because the similarities are absolutely there. Not exactly in play style. They're very different styles of basketball players, but they're both guards who grew up in the state of Washington, who ended up winning Big Sky Player of the Year, playing for schools that are local to Gonzaga. Steele, of course, at Eastern Washington a few years ago, and he was the Big Sky Player of the Year. Darling last year at Idaho State. And now they're both, Venters was in the transfer portal, committed to Gonzaga. Unfortunately, obviously for Steele, his career has not gone the way he hoped, with back-to-back season-ending injuries, limiting him to 0 games so far in the past 2 years at Gonzaga. But it'll be interesting to see if Darling is enamored by Gonzaga, if he grew up a Gonzaga fan. That's not something I know off the top of my head. I kind of dug in and didn't see anything on that. But if Gonzaga can pursue him and convince him to come home, again, the fit's not perfect, but it's also not that bad either. And if he could fill a role like a microwave scorer coming off the bench, that would be unbelievably incredible. It'd be Malachi Smith-esque for Gonzaga as a high-level scorer off the bench, something they could really use on next year's roster. But we're going to talk about the player that Darling would sort of be replacing were he to come to Gonzaga in Nolan Hickman, perhaps the most polarizing Gonzaga player of the past half decade or even longer. We're going to break down his senior season and his overall legacy at Gonzaga coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, get the supplies that you need from the site made for the skilled trades, Supply House. Whether you're in plumbing, HVAC, or electrical work, Supply House is the reliable way to order products online. Their easy-to-use website is packed with helpful resources and the latest product information to help you get the job done right. Plus, with a complete inventory of over 200,000 parts from 400-plus trusted brands, you'll find exactly what you need delivered fast from coast to coast. And if you need help with an order, Supply House offers expert support and industry-leading service, so you'll always talk to a real person. And for trade pros looking for an extra edge, their free Trade Master program offers exclusive perks like a dedicated phone line, free shipping, and discounts on every order. Thousands of skilled professionals are already taking advantage, so now it's your turn. Join the Trade Master program today at supplyhouse.com/TM and start ordering plumbing, HVAC, and electrical supplies with just a few clicks. Plus, use promo code SH5 for 5% off your first order. That's supplyhouse.com. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. Moving away from talking about a transfer portal target, potential target in Dylan Darling from Idaho State, the Spokane native, to instead talk about another relatively small guard from the state of Washington. This one being a guard not that Gonzaga is pursuing, but that Gonzaga is saying goodbye to, in Nolan Hickman, who is out of eligibility, has exhausted his final year of college basketball. We're going to talk about his history, his most recent season for Gonzaga, a little bit about his polarizing nature, and then we'll close out the show talking about his future, his legacy in Spokane, and what the Zags need to do to replace him. Kind of going to go full circle back to the start of the show. Nolan Hickman initially committed to Kentucky out of high school before decommitting and ultimately committing to Gonzaga a few weeks later. He's from Seattle, Washington, played on the west side of the state for a while before playing at Wasatch Academy in Mount Pleasant, Utah, a basketball factory. I think that was COVID reasons that he ended up playing over there, although I actually don't remember exactly. Either way, Hickman was a highly regarded prospect coming out of high school. It was considered a big coup that Gonzaga got him to flip from Kentucky and end up coming to Spokane. As a freshman, he was the backup point guard behind Andrew Nembhard. That team also had Rasir Bolton and Julian Strother and others, but Hickman was pretty distinctly the backup point guard as a freshman. He averaged about 5 points, 1.5 boards, a little less than 1.5 assists per game, played all 32 games, played 17 minutes a game. He was a role player, but a consistent part of Gonzaga's rotation right away as a true freshman in that 21-22 season. That was the Chet Holmgren year where Gonzaga got the 1 seed but lost to Arkansas in the Sweet 16. The next year, Hickman stepped into that starting point guard role vacated by Andrew Nembhard's departure and kind of struggled. And this is where the Nolan Hickman narrative was kind of formed in a lot of ways, because the expectation was that he was the point guard in waiting. He played backup point guard as a freshman. Sophomore year rolls around, Nolan Hickman steps into the point guard role. And it's very rare at Gonzaga. Mark Few and the staff are so good at timing things out where the next guy up is ready. They're always ready for the replacement. And even in the transfer portal era, they're pretty ready with where they need guys to be. We're expecting this guy to step into a starting role. Is he ready to step into it? Yes. Like they're just consistently very good at that. And this was a rare miss. Nolan Hickman wasn't ready to be Gonzaga's starting point guard. He just wasn't. He averaged just under 8 points a game, about 3 assists, 2.5 boards, 1.3 turnovers. Numbers weren't horrible. The problem with Nolan Hickman, this Nolan Hickman starting point guard experience in that 22-23 season was that he didn't really make a lot of things happen. Like he didn't turn the ball over a ton. He had some turnover issues early in the year, but ultimately he didn't really generate the offense. Like he didn't make a lot of things happen in that role. And it got to the point where it was, he just wasn't doing enough. I mean, barely not even 8 points per game. 3 assists is okay, but especially after seeing the last couple of years, we know that that's not typically what you see from a Gonzaga starting point guard. And they tried to make changes. They tried Hunter Salas at the 1, but he was having foul issues and has taken himself out of games a lot. He's also not really a pure point guard, something he worked on really hard at Wake Forest, but still never really became a pure point guard. They tried Rasir Bolton to an extent. Ultimately, by the end of the year, Drew Timme was practically playing point guard. Like they were getting him the ball as soon as he crossed half court and kind of letting him operate out of the high post and sort of just running that as their offense. It was a very unusual year for Gonzaga, and it caused a lot of vitriol to be directed at Hickman for not being ready to step into that starting point guard role. Then what happened is the next year Gonzaga said, yep, we needed a point guard. We need a pure point guard. They went out and got the best pure point guard that they possibly could in Ryan Nembhard. He transfers to Gonzaga from Creighton. Nolan Hickman very willingly says, I will step into another role, takes over the starting shooting guard role, and just abandons being a point guard. That takes maturity. That takes being a team player, being willing to make sacrifices for yourself because, and we'll talk about this in the final segment, 6'2" non-point guards don't play professionally, at least not in the NBA. Nolan Hickman was giving up the opportunity to showcase point guard skills, which is the only way he had a chance of making the NBA, in order to make Gonzaga better. That's a team player. That's a team player. And I think he deserves a lot of credit for that because not a lot of players have the ego to step away from what they perceive themselves to be in order to make room for a more talented player at their position while then adjusting to playing a new position. That's what Nolan Hickman did. And he had a great junior year. 14 points per game. That was a career high for him. A little under 3 assists, 2.5 boards, 1 steal, shot 41.3% from 3, played 35 minutes a night. It was the best year of his career for Nolan Hickman as a junior at Gonzaga last season, not this most recent season, back in the 23-24 season when Gonzaga ultimately made the Sweet 16 after defeating Kansas in the second round. Then this last season, 24-25, his senior year, Nolan Hickman, this is the first time, the only time in Nolan Hickman's 4-year career where he returned to the same role he had previously. He went from backup point guard to starting shooting guard, and then as a senior, still starting shooting guard, had the same teammates around him, Ryan Nembhard at the 1, Ben Gregg at the 4, Graham Ike at the 5, new addition in Caleb Battle, new addition, obviously, Michael Izaiah off the bench. But for the most part, Nolan Hickman returned to the same role with the same cast of characters around him. And he had a good year. I think the expectations were a little higher for Nolan Hickman than what he actually achieved as a senior. I mean, his points per game dropped from 14 as a junior to about 11 as a senior, but his playing time also dropped. He went from 35 minutes to 29.7 minutes because Gonzaga had more depth, with Dusty Stromer being able to take on a bigger role, with Emmanuel Innocente, with Caleb Battle, both being in the mix. They weren't there the year previously. Hickman was afforded an opportunity to rest more. And so his numbers dipped a little bit from that. Still averaged 2.5 boards, 2.5 assists, 1 steal. Shot 44.5% from three, which, folks, is just incredible. 44.5% from three, led the WCC, one of the highest marks in all of college basketball. He was also 52.5% on twos. He was also 93% from the free throw line. Insane levels of efficiency from Nolan Hickman as a senior. Career high in three-point percentage, career high in effective field goal percentage, career high in free throw percentage. One of the top three-point shooters in the entire country. Was a first-time All-WCC member, the only time he earned that award. He should have probably gotten it as a junior. He was a second-teamer. Regardless, he did at least finish his career with one WCC first-team nomination for Nolan Hickman. But again, he was polarizing. And we saw the highs and lows this season. 14 or more points in 12 of Gonzaga's 35 games. But he also had 5 or less points in 8 of Gonzaga's 35 games. Somewhat similar to Caleb Battle, who we talked about last week. You didn't quite know which version of Nolan Hickman you were going to get offensively. Sometimes he'd be, and perhaps the best example is his final 2 games. Against Georgia in the first round of the NCAA tournament, Nolan Hickman went nuclear. 18 points, 5 made threes on 6 attempts. He had 2 threes really early in that game. Mike White had no idea what to do. The Georgia head coach, Nolan Hickman, went crazy. A phenomenal performance to help Gonzaga coast to a 21-point win over Georgia in the first round of the NCAA tournament. In the second round against Houston, granted a much better team, especially defensively, Hickman did not score. 18 minutes, was benched most of the second half. Didn't score, 0 of 2 from the field. His final game of his collegiate career finishes with him scoring 0 points and not even really playing much in the second half. It was a really tragic way for his career to end. Most people are going to focus on Caleb Battle's career ending on a devastating inability to get up a shot in the closing seconds and the emotion he showed. But Nolan Hickman sitting on the bench in agony because he couldn't help this team win in his final game has to be up there. Really tough to see that happen for him. But again, it's kind of an encapsulation of Nolan Hickman's experience at Gonzaga to go from an 18.5 made 3 game to not contributing at all 2 days later is sort of part of why Hickman ended up being such a polarizing figure in his Gonzaga basketball career. So what's next for Nolan Hickman? What does the future hold? What legacy does he leave behind? We touched on that already. We'll get into it a little bit more to close out the show coming up here in just a second. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. We're still talking Nolan Hickman here in our season in review episode, talking about the senior guard. He is out of eligibility for these final segments for these season in reviews. We're always going to talk about the player's future. Obviously, in some cases, their future might be playing at a different school. It might be coming back to Gonzaga, having a different role. But we kind of start these, especially while the portal's still open and roster movement's still potentially happening. We're going to start with the seniors because we don't have to talk about their future on Gonzaga's roster because it's not going to happen. Nolan Hickman is done playing basketball for the Bulldogs of Gonzaga University. He is out of eligibility, and he's a rarity. And I'm not one to constantly complain about the new era of college basketball. Again, if you're a regular everyday listener, you know that I tend to avoid those conversations, in part because I am in favor of student athlete autonomy, although there are some changes that need to be made to the chaotic nature of current college basketball. But Nolan Hickman is somebody who is a rarity as a player who spent all 4 years at the same school. He does not have COVID eligibility. He does not have like a weird 5th year coming in, or the Ben Gregg goofiness where he kind of played 5 years sort of because he graduated early during the COVID era and got to be on that championship team. Nolan Hickman was he got here as a freshman. He left as a senior. He played 4 years at Gonzaga. He played pretty much every game across 4 years. And that was that. Like it's increasingly less common. And Nolan Hickman is that guy. And there's not a lot of other players kind of on that. On this Gonzaga roster right now. Ben Gregg was close before he departed, but Battle and Nembhard both departed without that being their case. It's not going to be the case for Graham Ike. It's not going to be the case for even somebody like Braden Huff, redshirted a year. He may end up being similar, but it's still not quite the same. It's a rarity. And there's not a lot of other players that we're going to be talking about in the next couple of years the same way we're talking about Nolan Hickman as a 4-year player who left the program, without having hit the transfer portal or anything like that. In terms of his basketball playing future, it's probably not going to be in the NBA. He's an older prospect as a senior. He has some NBA skill, namely the outside shooting, but he's not big enough. I mean, it's what I alluded to earlier. He's a 6'2" player who doesn't play point guard. Those guys are not making the NBA anymore. For every CJ McCollum, there's 1,000 guys who are around that size, who are not point guards, who don't make the NBA. It's just a really, really difficult role to be good enough at to make the league. You either have to be one of the most electric 3-point shooters ever, like a absolute knockdown 3-point shooter who can get your shot off quickly against NBA size and length, or you have to be just like the toughest SOB on the planet defensively. Like, it's a really hard role. Or CJ McCollum, who just has the fleetest feet in the NBA, just is flying around the floor, constantly moving without the ball. It's really hard to make it in that role. And I don't think Nolan Hickman has the requisite skills to kind of overcome his size, his age, and his lack of point guard kind of skills for that position. I just don't see it happening. I think that Nolan Hickman will likely get some attention. He's not going to get drafted. He does not show up on draft boards. He will not show up on draft boards. It's just not really in the cards for him, but I think he'll get a summer league invite. I think he could reasonably get a G League contract if he wanted to. Maybe he could parlay that into a 2-way contract in a best case scenario. But I also think that there's a pretty realistic chance that Nolan Hickman has a very successful, lengthy professional basketball career outside of the United States. Again, he could stay in the G League and play at that level easily. Malachi Smith's doing it. We saw Ryan Woolridge do it. Admon Gilder did it. Nolan Hickman's as good or better than those players. He's certainly, if those guys can all play in the G League, Nolan Hickman can absolutely play in the G League. Let's put it that way. But he may not want to. Maybe he wants to go play professionally overseas. I don't know exactly what's on his mind, but I think both of those are realistic options for him. I don't really think the NBA is a particularly realistic option for him, though. And in terms of his legacy, we've already talked about it a little bit, but he is somebody who I have not heard more complaints about a particular player or love for a particular player than Nolan Hickman. Like, Caleb Battle got a lot of love, but a lot of frustration as well. But like Nolan Hickman, people directed a lot of like serious anger at Nolan Hickman. I had people telling me he didn't deserve to even be in Gonzaga's rotation, which is blatantly false, and just an extreme overreaction. I had people, talking about him as one of the worst starters in Gonzaga basketball history. Not true at all. People lamenting his lack of effort, and I think that's a lot of what it was, is because of just the way he moves and the way his movement patterns on the court, and just like kind of more deadpan expressions, I think made people think he wasn't trying. Those people are wrong. Nolan Hickman tried extremely hard. He was a good defender, was just limited by his size. Mark Few in they put him on the opposing team's best guard a lot of the time. He was frequently tasked with guarding the opposing team's best players. Excuse me. Words are hard. And so I think that Hickman got a lot of unfair vitriol from the fan base, in part because the experiment of him as a point guard didn't work, and people still held that against him multiple years later, in part because he would have up and down performances. I'm not saying that he wasn't frustrating at times. He certainly was. Every Gonzaga player has been frustrating at times, but Hickman caught a lot more of that heat than I think he deserved. And I think that some of it just came from people not liking the way he moved, the way he looked. His personality didn't show through in a way that they liked, which frustrates me, because this is the kid who was dancing with the kennel every single game, who spoke so highly of being a player at Gonzaga, of being a part of the student section and being a part of the community, who's incredibly charitable with his time. He started a charity when he was in high school. Like, this is a great kid who I think caught a lot more hate than he should have. It reminds me of Josh Perkins. Josh Perkins, who was also Josh Perkins actually settled into being a point guard better than Nolan Hickman ever did, but similar situation of highly regarded prospect who didn't quite play the point guard position the way people wanted them to. Perkins ultimately, again, settled in when they added Nigel Williams-Goss, similar to how Hickman settled in when they added Ryan Nembhard. So there are a lot of parallels between those two guys. And I do think ultimately they're two players who will, by a large majority of the fan base, or a large percentage of the fan base, will be remembered more negatively than they probably should be. And that's a little sad for a kid who I think doesn't deserve that, in the same way that I didn't think Josh Perkins deserved some of the hate that he got as well. Last thing to talk about is how the Zags replace. And again, it circles back. Dylan Darling would be a replacement for Nolan Hickman in the sense that he'd be a small combo guard who can score the basketball. Not the only player, Gonzaga. Again, we don't know how connected Gonzaga even is to Dylan Darling, but we do know Gonzaga is connected to Rodney Rice out of Maryland, a 6'4" two guard who's a very good three-point shooter. Bryce Lindsey from James Madison, who it sounds like is going to end up at Maryland in replacing Rodney Rice, if we're being clear on that. So, but he's a player Gonzaga's contact as well. Izaiah Pasha, who has Gonzaga in his top three alongside Texas Tech and Penn State. He's visiting Texas Tech this weekend, expected to visit Gonzaga next week. He might be committing to Gonzaga within a week, and he's a 6'4" scoring two guard. He would be your Nolan Hickman replacement. He would step directly into that role. There's other types. Maybe the Zags pursue Malik Thomas from San Francisco, LaJuan Watts from Washington State, Wesley Yates, who we spoke about from USC on Monday's episode, Xavier Lee from Princeton. There are plenty of players in the portal that fit as kind of a Nolan Hickman type replacement. There's a few we've talked about who are more of Caliph Battle type replacements in some ways, but I think that the Zags are pretty heavily involved in the portal on looking at guys who fit the bill of a Nolan Hickman type player. Right now, I think if the Zags roster as is, you have Braden Smith starting at the 1, Jalen Warley starting at the 3, EK and Huff starting at the 4 and the 5. The 2 is the open position right now. If the season were to start tomorrow, it would be Emmanuel Innocente. If the season were to start without any more roster changes, it might be Steele Venters if he's healthy enough to play. Davis Fogel, incoming freshman. I doubt Gonzaga envisions him as a starter or a big-time player right away, but he certainly could be. So there's some kind of guys in the mix right now, but I do think that shooting guard is the most likely position for Gonzaga to fill in the starting lineup out of the transfer portal, which is why we focused a lot of our conversations on guys like Rodney Rice and Wesley Yates, and today Dylan Darling and Izaiah Pasha and others. And we're going to continue to do that because we got multiple more shows this week. We got 5 episodes a week going forward all the way until August. The season is over, but the Locked On Zags podcast is still giving you shows 5 days a week. We're going to talk transfer portal. We're going to continue the season in review episode series as well. We'll get into some NBA draft stuff, some women's basketball, some baseball stuff, all that coming up here in the next couple of months here on Locked On Zags. So don't go anywhere. Hit that subscribe button if you have not done so yet. I appreciate every single one of you for doing so. Thanks again for listening, folks. Have a fantastic rest of your day. And as always, go Zags.